So I'm really pleased to be contributing to Ecodemia's public talk series, and today I'm going to talk to you about transition design and a research project that I undertook with my colleagues Gideon Kossoff and Tim Gasparek to map the spread of and response to COVID-19 in the United States. The lecture will describe the anatomy of systems problems and their dynamics, meaning how they change and transition over time. And then I'll show you the COVID-19 research and its emergent connection to a couple of other complex problems we're seeing here in the United States. So complex wicked problems are things like this: crime, income inequality, climate change, terrorism, the loss of biodiversity, lack of access to affordable housing and education, and things like global pandemics. And as we're seeing now, these connect to other wicked problems like racism and police brutality. These problems are known as wicked problems, and this is a term coined by urban planner Horst Vertel in the 1960s to describe a type of problem that he argued was unsolvable because of these many characteristics. And the list is very long, but among the most challenging characteristics are that every problem is unique and constantly changing. There is no clear shared problem definition. There are multiple stakeholders with conflicting agendas, and these problems straddle organizational and disciplinary boundaries. And every wicked problem is connected to other wicked problems. And as we can see from events unfolding in the streets around the world right now, to illustrate this, let's take a ubiquitous wicked problem like homelessness. The problem ticks all of Vertel's boxes, and if I asked you what other complex problems homelessness is connected to, poverty and the rising cost of housing might spring to mind. But if we look closer, we see that homelessness is also connected to a host of other problems as well, like the high cost of education, racism, substance abuse, and gentrification, and many others. Problems like these manifest in most cities around the world, but always in ways that are distinct to that particular place and culture. The interconnections and interdependencies within a problem cluster like this are so complex that it boggles the mind. It's almost more than we can take in, and so we don't. In fact, we do the opposite. We set about making problems simpler and more manageable by tackling little pieces of them and then forgetting that they are part of something bigger. We do this in the way we frame problems, fund them, and solve them. So over time, a lot of money, time, and effort gets directed at pieces of a much larger problem. Because these efforts are disconnected and fragmented, not much progress is made. We essentially nibble away at the edges of a problem like homelessness for decades or more. And it looks something like this. We might identify a more or less manageable problem like the lack of homeless shelters in Pittsburgh without thinking about whether it's part of a larger problem. So we raise money to build a homeless shelter or two. If, however, we begin to trace the roots of the problem up to a higher level, we might work our way up to the bigger problem of a lack of affordable housing. But if we go farther and really look at the entirety of the wicked problem, homelessness in Pittsburgh, then things become really intimidating. But wait, it gets worse. Remember I said that most wicked problems are connected to other wicked problems? Well, if you view those other problems as part of the problem context, it begins to look something like this. And this is the point at which we realize that no single individual or discipline can solve a wicked problem. It requires radical transdisciplinary collaboration over very long arcs of time to effectively address it. And it takes one more very important thing: a better understanding of systems themselves, how they behave, and how they transition over time. Essentially, we all need to become students of systems. And systems themselves are perhaps best explained by this old joke. Two fish bump into each other and one says, "How's the water?" And the other replies, "What water?" Marshall McLuhan, in his book War and Peace in the Global Village, said one thing fish know nothing about is water, since they have no anti-environment which would enable them to perceive the element they live in. Systems are so ubiquitous and our interactions with them so pervasive, we really don't see them, and therefore we don't understand them very well. My work is concerned with how we learn to see systems and understand how they behave. So we live in a world of systems nested within systems, nested within systems. There are transportation systems, infrastructural systems, financial, economic, and communication systems, and all of these are permeated by cultural and disciplinary norms, laws and informal practices, or ways of doing things. And together, all of these form what is known as a socio-technical system, which is in turn situated within the natural world. And these systems are always in transition. But despite this constant movement, socio-technical systems are highly resistant to change. They get set in their ways, just like we do. But change they can, as a result of three things: large and small events, technological innovations and breakthroughs, and changes in beliefs, social norms, and practices. So in both material and non-material ways. And any of these changes can happen either suddenly or gradually. But let's come back to the concept of transition. Human societies are always in transition, but these transitions have been largely unintentional, full of drift, and we really only understand their ramifications in hindsight. We call it history. The question before all of us in the 21st century is whether we can intentionally transition our societies and organizations toward more sustainable, equitable, and desirable long-term futures. Transition design argues that the long-term future we are transitioning toward aren't necessarily the futures we want, and contends that we can intentionally change these transition trajectories toward futures we do want. Now that sounds like a monumental undertaking, but if we use the current situation to think about transition trajectories, we see that all of these countries started out at more or less the same place. And we've learned that small changes in the present can make a big difference in where you end up in the future. Transition design is essentially an approach for intentionally shifting systems trajectories. The Multilevel Perspective Tool, or MLP, is a framework developed 2 decades ago in Northern Europe to explain how socio-technical systems change and transition over long periods of time. And researchers have identified 3 key levels: the landscape, the regime or status quo, and the niche. The landscape level is where large events, collective beliefs, and social norms begin to impact and fracture the regime level below. Landscape level forces usually accrue and exert gradual pressure, but as you can see, events like war, 9/11, and COVID-19 can appear suddenly and unexpectedly, creating sweeping change throughout the system. The niche level is where small experiments and innovations can be incubated off the radar and go unchallenged by the status quo. Niche level events include new inventions, technologies, and practices, or even radical new policy ideas such as universal basic income. But the important thing to know is that large, unexpected events like COVID-19 always open up opportunities at the niche level that can be exploited for good if you know how to read the system's dynamics. I'm going to show you just 2 examples of how change happens in a socio-technical system. Here, conditions already present at the regime level begin to constellate and exert pressure from within, opening a fracture and letting niche-level innovations rush in. Startups like Airbnb and Uber, combined with social networking technologies, exploited the fracture and rushed into the regime. And the speed at which they were absorbed into and transformed the regime was astounding. Their integration into the regime created more fractures, and new industry ecologies formed around both Uber and Airbnb, utterly transforming tourism and industry sectors. Now, a decade later, what started as niche-level sharing economy experiments have permeated the regime and led to the rise of the sharing economic paradigm at the landscape level. But with these transitions come myriad unintended consequences in the form of the wicked problems like the ones in red. Now, this is how the regime has looked for some time now. But a couple of months ago, Uber laid off 6,000 people in a 3-minute Zoom call, later followed by another 3,000 employees. 2 weeks before that, Airbnb laid off 25% of their workforce, all because of a major disruption at the landscape level known as COVID-19, our second example, which showed up suddenly as a problem of nearly unprecedented global magnitude. You can actually watch it fracturing the regime in real time, igniting a flurry of niche-level activity that is nearly impossible to follow, but which contains within it the seeds of paradigmatic change for both good and bad. And as we observe this accelerated transition we're all in, we must try to anticipate the unintended consequences of these new innovations that are being hastily implemented. So before they turn into wicked problems, we begin to intervene. Even more importantly, we must quickly read the system dynamics to try and drive positive systems level change and shift our current unsustainable transition trajectories. In March, April, and early May, we started a research project on COVID-19 in the US. First, we mapped the problem in these 5 areas to understand its interconnections, feedback loops, and stuck places. In the second phase of research, we went back in time using the MLP to understand how the problems evolved in order to reveal new insights and connections that can deepen our understanding of and response to the problem in the present. These 2 phases, when combined with a third foresighting and backcasting phase, create a radically large problem context that includes past, present, and future. The problem map is quite large. It's about 22 feet long, and it reveals the systems dynamics, feedback loops, and conflicting stakeholder agendas that can be either barriers or boons to problem resolution. I'll quickly walk you around the map so you can see that it looks at many different facets of this problem. And key insights or urgent issues have been highlighted in each section in the red boxes. Because of the lockdown, all of our research has been secondary, meaning it has come mostly from mainstream news media and special reports. We use scientific papers and journal articles when we could, but it's been difficult because events are still unfolding. The blue dots in the upper right corner of each node link to resource sources. The problem is really, and that's a whole nother lecture, the dearth of appropriate system mapping tools that are available, which could be a reason we're not very good at systems thinking. Let's begin in the environmental issues section, where we see that COVID-19 is of zoonotic origins, meaning viruses like this make the leap from animals to humans when their habitats are destroyed and new interactions between species occur, and/or they are brought into contact with humans, usually via wet markets, which we see in the economics section is part of the $73 billion luxury food industry, in which animals, wild animals, are captured or farmed for consumption or use in Chinese medicine. A key finding is this: Even though we've known about the connection between the destruction of wildlife habitats, viruses like COVID-19 for a very long time, and we know that these viruses can be spread via wet markets, this industry has now grown to employ more than 1 million people, making it nearly impossible to close down. And if we look at legislation related to the problem in the political and governance section, we see that policies that might ban the sale of wild animals are very likely to drive the entire industry underground, resulting in a black market that would remove what few oversight currently exist, which could in turn lead to more pandemics. The social issues section looks at what we think and how we act. Here we see that our attitudes about and relationship to animals is one of the root causes of the pandemic. And many disease experts are arguing that we should view the pandemic as a warning that humans must begin to see animals as partners whose health and habitat welfare is connected to our own. And these attitudes are connected to the higher level issue of collective mindsets and worldviews. Here we see that American beliefs about civil liberties, individual freedoms, and the right to bear arms have impeded an effective response to the pandemic and have shaped the administration and police responses to the George Floyd protests in cities around the country that you're no doubt reading about in our fake news media. But there are valid concerns that underlie many quarantine protests. About half of US workers' health insurance is tied to their employment, and about 1 in 5 Americans have lost their jobs or are furloughed without pay and benefits, leaving about 27 million Americans without health care and the ability to meet their basic needs. In the economic and business section, we see that this issue is connected to the US's privatized for-profit healthcare industry that is part of a larger economic system that places shareholder profit above the welfare and job security of workers. This emphasis on the for-profit economy shows up in the political section in a way that's chilling. In the early days of the pandemic, when it was assumed that COVID-19 primarily threatened the elderly, many politicians argued that older citizens, like me, should be willing to die rather than risk the health of the economy by shutting it down. So in many ways, the US system pits the welfare of the economy and corporate profits against the welfare of its workers and citizens. And the backdrop for all of this, of course, has been an extremely polarized political landscape. From the start, the pandemic has been politicized by both parties and the Trump administration, which has contributed to the virus's rapid spread and our nation's appalling response to it. In the social issues section, we see that the pandemic has left many groups especially vulnerable, such as those in forced living conditions. But one of the most tragic consequences in the US that is also connected to the current protests is the vulnerability of our African American and Black populations who are contracting the virus and dying from it in shockingly disproportionate numbers. There are many other connections and feedback loops within this map, such as the connection and feedback between Fox News and the Trump administration, but I don't have time to go into that today. I will point out, though, that so far as we all know, the one clear positive in all of this is that many of our natural ecosystems are beginning to rejuvenate because we humans have simply stopped. Here you see the final problem map with key insights and root issues highlighted in the red boxes on the left. And these were used as the basis for the next phase of research, which uses the NLP introduced earlier to trace the historic origins of these root issues and insights. This map is also very large. It's about 15 or 18 feet long and begins in 1770 with the framing of our Constitution, which we think has direct bearing on the uniquely American response to the pandemic. Entries in red indicate pandemic-related events, and you can see large events that shape the US response at the top landscape level. You'll also see that we've articulated a long-term future vision in which viruses are not common and pandemic, but are rather rare and contained, to show how the third step of the research might be integrated. Along the timeline, we pull out narrative threads and insights about the past that help us understand the problem in the present. Here we see the roots of the American concern with civil liberties, and the right to bear arms is very old. At the landscape level, we see that a Southern enslavement economy was a key part of the 400 years of institutionalized racism in the US, which is directly connected to the fact that African Americans and Blacks are contracting COVID-19 and dying from it in wildly disproportionate numbers. And this, of course, is also connected to the current protests around the world over George Floyd's death at the hands of Minneapolis police. The pandemic has thrown a spotlight on all of the infrastructural weaknesses in the US, particularly our healthcare system. Tracing its evolution, we see that the founding of the American Medical Association and its early profit-based partnership with Big Pharma, that continues to this day, helps explain why our system is so broken. Paul Krugman pointed out in the New York Times about a month ago that the US almost got universal healthcare coverage in 1947, but segregationists blocked it out of the fear that it would lead to racially integrated hospitals. So here we see the intersection of the wicked problems of COVID-19, our broken healthcare system, and racism. Another important historic fact is that coronavirus was actually discovered in 1967. So for over half a century, we've known about it, we've known its zoonotic in origin, and then it gets into the human disease stream through the capture and consumption of wild animals and the destruction of their habitats through deforestation. So we've had this knowledge for half a century, and yet the luxury food industry has continued to grow. In the present, the niche level is really where the action has been. Incredible innovations, technological breakthroughs, and research were popping like corn as we concluded this research. But what should we be anticipating? What are the key questions our communities and organizations should be asking? What questions and opportunities has the pandemic opened up for your organization, community, or industry sector? These questions and many more should guide all of our actions in the coming months and years. These niche level events that we see here are really just the tip of the iceberg. But one thing we've seen is a striking difference in the nature of responses around the world. You can see that in the US, the white bubbles on the left, the response has been characterized by new types of collaboration in the private sector area and academia, as well as what I'll call service offered pivots that leverage existing technology and manufacturing capabilities to respond to a variety of pandemic-related needs. In contrast, the response in many other countries that actually have decent governments has been led by governments and civil service sectors. This opens up an important conversation about the need for both bottom-up and top-down strategies for addressing not just the pandemic, but the problems connected to it. Transition design research like this aims to produce a deeper understanding of the problem and its roots. And when combined with a long-term vision phase that is co-created by stakeholders themselves, it can open up new and more effective strategies for problem resolution. The objective is to develop ecologies of systems interventions that solve for multiple issues simultaneously. This results in increased traction to fracture the regime in an ongoing cycle of intervening and solutioning at multiple levels of scale over multiple horizons of time, resolving the complex problem, but also shifting the trajectory of the socio-technical system transition. This used to be the end of the lecture, but since we finished the research a couple of months ago, the world has changed drastically yet again. COVID-19 seems to have become a catalyst for revealing and exacerbating a host of other wicked problems in the US that have been building for decades or even hundreds of years. So going forward, our research would likely now include the mapping of two other interrelated and interconnected problems: racism and police brutality. We can already see the ways in which these problems intersect in the US, and transition design argues that we need to frame these problems in radically large spatio-temporal contexts, not zero in on just pieces of them. So problem maps like these would ideally be constructed over a long period of time by both experts from the different disciplines, as well as the stakeholders who are affected by the problem. So focusing on the areas of intersection between wicked problems can often reveal what we call zones of opportunity, in which those ecologies of interventions I mentioned before can address multiple problems and issues simultaneously. In order to gain traction and not address pieces of the problem, these solutions or interventions must be connected to each other and the co-created long-term vision. Engaging in long-term visioning processes enables stakeholders to transcend their differences in the present and imagine a future that they all want. This process of problem mapping, long-term visioning, and systems solutioning becomes an ongoing, inclusive cycle in which stakeholders themselves anchor a transition project that extends for years or even decades. As systems problems are resolved and the community, city, or region shifts its transition trajectory toward a common, desirable, and sustainable long-term future. The transition design approach is aimed at several things. It leverages knowledge and wisdom from within the system via the stakeholders. It frames problems within radically large contexts. It facilitates a shared understanding of the problem and enables stakeholders to co-create long-term visions of the future they want and transcend their differences in the present. The problem maps that I showed today are now available on my academia.edu website. And if you'd like to know more about transition design, the syllabus for our master's and doctoral seminar is up online. The website has extensive readings, videos, and downloadable teaching materials that are now being integrated and used by more than 20 universities worldwide. You can also contact me if you'd like to be put on a mailing list. And that's it. Thank you.